So, now that we've gone over Batman v Superman, it should be a breeze to go through the rest of the movies in the DCEU, right? I mean, Batman v Superman is where all of the major problems were, so I mean, it can't possibly get any worse than that, right? Right? God damn it. Out of all of the films that have been released thus far in the DCEU, Suicide Squad is, objectively speaking, the absolute worst one, which is ironic considering the quality of the one which came before it, and the best one out of the whole lot was right around the corner. From top to bottom, Suicide Squad is a shallow, unfocused mess of a film which has learnt nothing from the mistakes of the franchise's past, and if anything, was even more disappointing than its predecessor. If, like me, you saw the trailers for Batman v Superman when they were coming out, you were probably getting a sense that it was going to suck right from the get-go. The casting choices alone provided a lot of cause for concern, and when that trailer came out, which practically spoilt the whole film, that was hardly a good sign that it was going to be any good. But take a look at the trailer for Suicide Squad. It's one of the greatest trailers ever made, and it does exactly what a trailer should do, get you hyped as hell for the film that it's advertising, and I most certainly was. I was convinced that this would be the movie to redeem the DCEU after the pain of sitting through Batman v Superman, and then I watched the film at midnight. A screen full of fellow comic book nerds, and the collective thought after watching the film was... well, shit. Yeah. That. But before we do a full deep dive into everything wrong with Suicide Squad, let's do a little backtracking, because there is one key question that we need to answer before we get into this. We seriously have to figure out... So let's go back a little bit into history. Warner Brothers announces its big cinematic universe and sets out its 10-year plan to overthrow Marvel beginning in 2016 with Batman v Superman. In 2014, David Ayer is hired to write and direct Suicide Squad and is given a grand total of 6 weeks to pen the script, as the studio has already set a date for the film's release. In 2014, the cast for the movie is announced, with the highlights being Jared Leto as the Joker, Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn, Will Smith as Deadshot, and Viola Davis as Amanda Waller. With the pre-production stage completed, principal photography begins in 2015 and comes to an end in August of the same year, with most of the filming taking place in Toronto and Chicago. Then, with post-production firmly underway, Batman v Superman is released to tremendously negative reviews, with many critics citing the dour, humorless tone as a major drawback. In light of this, anxieties begin to grow among Warner Brothers executives over the tone and aesthetic of Suicide Squad being too grim. Thus, while Ayer and his crew continue pursuing their intended vision, Warner Brothers effectively goes behind Ayer's back and commissions Trailer Park, the company responsible for creating the vastly popular trailer for Suicide Squad, to edit an entirely different cut of the film to fit more in line with what the original trailer promised. In May of 2016, Ayer's darker cut of the film is screened to audiences alongside the lighter, more studio-mandated film to see which gets a better response. Neither received positive feedback from audiences, and as a result, Warner Brothers hastily orders David Ayer and his entire production crew to drastically alter the tone and aesthetic of Suicide Squad to fit into something more lighthearted and comedic. After this, significant rewrites and reshoots are done to adhere to the studio's demands, and all of this took place only months before the film was scheduled to be released. While the typical cost of reshoots in most films usually comes to between $6 million and $10 million, the cost of reshooting scenes for Suicide Squad reportedly comes close to $22 million. After reshoots are completed and further editing takes place, a final version of the film is released on the deadline, despite a huge chunk of Ayer's original work being left firmly in the dirt by Warner Brothers. By the time Suicide Squad was released to the public, the movie had been through the blender more times than could be counted and only barely resembled whatever original version that Ayer started out with. Though given the studio interference, the absurdly limiting time constraints, the fact that Ayer had all but 6 weeks to write the script, I'm not likely to believe that his vision was all that great to begin with. From what I can see, this project was doomed to fail right from the very start, and that is in no small part thanks to Warner Brothers being so hasty in creating as many tie-ins to its cinematic universe as possible. It's hardly a surprise that the film flopped so bad given how little time Ayer had to write the script and how many times Warner Brothers came up to him demanding he change things after the principal photography of the movie had already been completed. Every single aspect of Suicide Squad is emblematic of the overall problem of the DCEU. From the all-over-the-place tone, to the bad attempts at humor, to the overly drab color palette, to the awkward references to future movies, to the absurdly lazy writing.
Not me, shorty. I'm beautiful.
It's clear that this movie was as big a studio-mandated clusterfuck as the film that came before it, and it's just as obvious here as it was there. Which brings me to the first major problem with Suicide Squad, which is... easily the worst aspect of Suicide Squad is its editing, and this is a film with dialogue like this.
Not me, shorty. I'm beautiful.
I've got some grape soda on ice and a bearskin rug waiting.
Out of every element of the film, the studio interference is perhaps most evident in the way that it is pieced together. And when I say pieced together, I mean more hammered into place like two completely separate jigsaw puzzles that don't fit. Thanks to the haphazard production, little of what ends up in Suicide Squad makes any sense, either from a narrative perspective or a pacing perspective. None of the scenes flow well into each other, and the transitioning within scenes feels rushed and sloppily done. Just take the first scene of the movie. No, really, literally, the first 60 seconds of Suicide Squad highlights exactly what's wrong with the entire film. In fact, for the sake of saving time, I'm just going to use the first minute of Suicide Squad as a microcosm of every bad editing choice that is made in the movie. Titles roll to a generic action soundtrack. I can see Warner Brothers really put a lot of money into the music of this film. Then we get a bizarre transition through the DC logo onto the first scene, and this is our very first shot of the movie. Bland, drab, boring, dark landscapes with a concrete skyline and some blurry buildings in the background, and right here we have editing problem number one. A moment ago we had the names of the movie's production companies surrounded in surreal neon lighting. It's a bit silly looking, but it's colourful and it's at least partially pleasing to the eye. Then when the titles fade into the actual film itself, we get the same neon filter, which then quickly transitions into that boring, bland scenery I just mentioned. The movie literally takes more care to make the production company's names more colourful than the rest of the film. This is a perfect example of the kind of mismatched editing which plagues this movie. There is no consistency in the visual tone of each scene. One scene might be bright and colourful, while the very next one could be grim, drab, and utterly devoid of colour. This lack of consistency can get very distracting in a film, and here it's even more damning because it highlights the schizophrenic nature of the movie's production. In having such a varied style and tone, Suicide Squad wants to appeal to as wide a demographic as possible, but it just comes off as being incoherent and unenjoyable to all crowds because it doesn't end up excelling at any of the tones that it's trying to go for. It doesn't go full force with the colourful stylism suggested by the production titles, nor the gritty realism suggested by the first establishing shot. Suicide Squad is a movie with no sense of tonal identity. But getting back to the first 60 seconds of the film, after the sloppy transition we get a swooping shot of that boring background as we zoom into a faraway building while text appears at the bottom right hand corner of the screen. House of the Rising Sun plays as we cut to the outside of a prison where our cast members are locked up, presumably being detained until they agree to take part in the stinker of a film. And then we transition inside the facility where we see a guard overlooking a series of screens, then quickly cut to Will Smith doing his usual morning workout. So let's go ahead and unpack the editing problems in those last few seconds. Firstly, the text that we get in the very first shot is black, which not only makes it impossible to see once the camera moves over the dark green grass of the landscape, but we also only have a quick second to read all 3 lines of it before it disappears amongst the shrubbery. Then, a second later, we have text text on a wall outside the prison, and again, we are only given a brief amount of time to read it before a truck passes by the screen. Special edition Tatooine style, baby. Not only is the first text difficult to read and could have easily been fixed with, I don't know, a simple change in font, color, or placement of the words, but the editing here is incredibly inconsistent and nonsensical. We go from a shot like this, which lasts for a comparatively long time, and then we cut to about 2 seconds of this before cutting again to Deadshot inside his cell. I know this seems like a nitpick, but transitions like this really annoy me when I notice them in films because they're just so sloppy, and they are everywhere here. If you rewatch Suicide Squad and pay more attention to how each shot transitions into each other, you'll notice how inconsistent they are. There's no real transition between this shot here and the next again shot here. They're just kind of stapled together regardless of whether or not they work well with one another. Now, I know this kind of stuff is probably a bit nitpicky to someone who isn't me, and yeah, pretty much really is the very definition of nitpicky, but to someone like me who is currently studying film and media in college and learning about the basic fundamental principles of editing, this kind of stuff really sticks out like a sore thumb. And the fact that it is so prevalent in Suicide Squad just highlights how much of a clusterfuck this thing must have been to make. Another example of what I'm talking about would be here.
Enchantress.
Flag, talk to me. What's going on down there?
Amanda, she bolted.
Say it again?
She bolted!
The scene just randomly transitions to another location and the characters talk about an event which has occurred off-screen in the last few seconds that we don't know anything about. It told us about what happened after the fact without actually showing it. This kind of lazy, haphazard editing is prevalent throughout the entire movie, and again, it's easy to see where it originated. More than likely, it occurred thanks to the reshoots and during the 5 million edits done by Warner Brothers and Trailer Park. And the editing only gets worse and worse and worse the further into the film you get. 4 minutes in, we get one of the most random choices for a title insert ever with this.
And that is why I'm here.
It feels like the title was just randomly put here because the studio editors couldn't be bothered to think of a better place to put it. They just slapped it in here and said, yeah, that's good enough. I mean, come on, why should we bother putting any thought into this, you know? It's not like the audience is going to care. Yeah, well, you didn't exactly count on someone like me showing up, did you? And I really do understand that this does seem like nitpicking to most of you, but all of these lazy editing choices just stand as further examples of how bad the production of this movie was. Thanks to the sheer number of odd and lazy editing mistakes, it's pretty clear how much of a mess this film was pretty much from the word go. There's not one scene in the whole thing that doesn't have some form of bad editing, and most of that comes from the fact that we are watching 3 separate versions of the same film squeezed into one amalgamated monstrosity. And even if all you want out of this thing is some mindless popcorn action nonsense, which is all it really aspires to be, it doesn't even succeed at being that because it can't get one of the basic building blocks of filmmaking right. And that is clear right from the very first minute of the movie. That is a special kind of bad. A problem I've already mentioned is Suicide Squad's bafflingly inconsistent tone. While a lot of the reasons why the tones are so mismatched have already been stated, with the reshoots and the re-edits clearly being huge factors, I think the tone problems were there right from the get-go of the film's production. The additions that Warner Brothers insisted on making probably just exacerbated them. An example of what I mean is simply in the movie's plot and the way that it treats its characters. For the first half hour or so, the film states multiple times very clearly that these guys are bad people, except for maybe Diablo, who's feeling repentant after, you know, killing God knows how many poor bastards in prison. But in any case, everything from the advertising to the script to the flashy titles that come up at the beginning is meant to illustrate just how bad these people are. The only reason that they're doing anything in the movie is because Amanda Waller is making them. They will die if they do not go and stop Enchantress, simple as that. Not counting the fact that this has got to be one of the single dumbest plans ever devised by a US government official since... well, okay, maybe that's up for debate, but this really doesn't lend much support to the audience being invested in whether or not the day is saved. This kind of story where bad guys screw over other bad guys to stop bigger bad guys could have worked for an interesting take on the comic book superhero genre, but the problem is that the movie doesn't give us much context as to why any of them are even bothering to save the world at the end, because of how much the movie flip-flops on them being bad people to them being sympathetic people. Suicide Squad wants you to know that these guys are bad, and they shouldn't be trusted, and they are, in Rick Flagg's words,
psychotic antisocial freaks.
Yet, at the same time, it's wanting you to sympathize and care about them enough to give a shit whether or not any of them die by the end. That's what I mean about the movie having conflicting tones. It can't figure out if it wants you to care about the characters or not, and that is bad filmmaking. And this kind of conflicting tone doesn't just go for the characters, it seeps its way into every single element of Suicide Squad's construction, right down to the story, to the pacing, to the really bizarre soundtrack, which... yeah, I might as well go into that now. This is something that has been commented on by a lot of people, and I figured I might as well give my 2 cents here. The soundtrack for Suicide Squad is almost insufferable in how much it panders to pop music fans, and it only seems to be more emblematic of the overall tonal problems in the film. In the first 5 minutes alone, we get 3 separate pop songs, House of the Rising Sun, You Don't Own Me, and Sympathy for the Devil, all in less than 10 minutes of the movie starting. Then, as the movie goes on, we get a string of pop songs that are more on the nose than Leonardo DiCaprio's cocaine stash in The Wolf of Wall Street. Hey, Amanda Waller is kinda devilish, and Harley Quinn literally calls her the devil. Let's just play Sympathy for the Devil. Harley Quinn is super freaky, so let's go ahead and play Super Freak. They're flying in on a helicopter over a city. Let's play Spirit in the Sky. Bella Reeve Prison is a bad place in Louisiana, so let's play House of the Rising Sun, which is about a bad place in New Orleans. The sheer gluttony of pop songs in Suicide Squad is yet another symptom of Warner Brothers tampering with the DCEU and their blatant envy of Marvel's success. It's obvious that the studio took a look at Guardians of the Galaxy and its significant pop song listings and went, people like that kind of stuff in a film, so let's go ahead and steal that idea and do the exact same thing. And that is the correct word, by the way. Steal. The only reason the decision was made to include all of these pop songs, which add nothing to the film, was because the studio wanted it to be more lighthearted than it was originally, and so they copied the same idea that Marvel had with Guardians of the Galaxy just to rip off the same idea. But while the inclusion of so many pop songs made sense for Guardians of the Galaxy by not only including a few upbeat and incredibly appropriate pop songs that were much better spread out and paced than in Suicide Squad, by the by, but they also have heavy significance in the narrative. They tied into the main character's emotional arc. These songs that we are listening to, the Awesome Mix, those were the songs that Star-Lord's mother loved so much, and she played them for him when he was a child. They're his last real connection to the mother that he lost. These songs serve a purpose in the story. In Suicide Squad, however, these songs serve no purpose other than to lighten the movie up a little bit, and even then, all they end up doing is contributing to the film's overall tonal schizophrenia. For instance, You Don't Own Me starts playing when Harley Quinn is introduced, which gives the film a somewhat lighter tone for a second before this bit of uncomfortableness happens. The soundtrack in Suicide Squad doesn't really make much sense in the story aside from it just being there to lighten the movie up a little bit, and even then when it does that, all it does is make the tones remarkably inconsistent within each scene. It wants to go from dark and drab to happy and upbeat, then it wants to be comical, and then all of a sudden it wants to be really dark and serious, and there's absolutely no consistency with anything that the movie is trying to do. Setting up characters or plot points in a movie is a fairly basic concept. If it's a character, you quite simply introduce them in the narrative by maybe having them do something pertinent to the plot, or showcase what it's like to be them. For instance, Rey in Star Wars Force Awakens is first introduced by showing her daily life as a scavenger on Jakku. We see her typical workday, as well as the living conditions that she's been saddled with for, as we can see here, quite an incredibly long time. Alternatively, you could set up a character or characters in a more verbal context by maybe having them converse with one another. To give another example, the opening to the Firefly movie Serenity has Captain Malcolm going through his entire ship and striking up conversations with every member of his crew. This gives those of us who watched the show a bittersweet reminder of how awesome it was before its untimely passing, and anyone who didn't watch the show a quick but effective summation of each of the characters' personalities, their roles within the ship, their relationship to the main character, as well as each other, and so on and so on, all within just a few quick bits of dialogue. Suicide Squad's way of introducing its characters is a bit different. Instead of introducing the main cast with, say, a bit of witty banter or through character actions, we get flashy titles popping up on the screen spewing out factoids about each character like a goddamn top trump card. Not only is this an astonishingly lazy way of introducing your characters by literally having the movie spell out its exposition on the screen in case the audience misses any key details, because they are just that stupid, am I right? But for whatever bizarre reason, the filmmakers felt the need to reiterate the same information to the audience several times over for nearly an hour of the movie's runtime. First, we're introduced to Harley Quinn and Deadshot, the two characters who get the most screen time in the film, and then we get the 17-minute long neon trump card exposition scene where we are introduced to the full cast, including Deadshot and Harley Quinn again, two characters that we already knew. Then after that, we get yet another introduction to all these same characters with Amanda Waller at the Pentagon, and then we get another introduction to all of these characters when Amanda Waller and Rick Flag visit the prison. The entire first act of this movie, nearly an hour of the movie's runtime, is dedicated entirely to reinforcing information that we already knew. Imagine if at the beginning of Force Awakens we get that little montage showing an average day in the life of Rey, telling us who she is using entirely visual means, and then, say, the movie goes ahead and spends another 20 minutes of its runtime having Rey talk with some random person about her daily tasks. Then when she meets up with Poe, she spends yet another 20 minutes talking about her life yet again. This is information that can be conveyed quickly and easily, and for whatever reason, Suicide Squad's faith in its audience's attention span is so little that they felt like they had to literally spoon feed you information several times over for you to get the message. And the movie doesn't stop introducing its characters until we're nearly halfway through the film. Seriously, it gets to the 50-minute mark and we suddenly get yet another character introduction with Katana, who, like most of the characters, is given very little expansion or development as the movie goes on. So that means that the film spends almost an hour setting up its cast over and over and over again in case the audience misses any of the pertinent information that it's spoon-feeding us. And yes, I know this is a lot of characters to juggle in a film like this. You've got to take time to set them up. But setting them up not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times over, and often reiterating the exact same information multiple times when you could have spent that time expanding what was already there, that's just profoundly lazy filmmaking. But for me, the most annoying thing about Suicide Squad's cast is that occasionally it does actually manage to get its characters right. Just, you know, not all that often. There are rare moments throughout the film where it pays the comic characters due respect and allows the audience to see them actually being themselves without introducing them for the zillionth time. The flashback scenes with Harley and Deadshot are really effective and do a good job of getting us at least a little bit invested in them. But these intros are ruined by the fact that for the rest of the film, none of the characters are allowed to, well, be their characters. With a movie that spends its first hour setting up the cast, you'd think it might set a little bit of time aside to let us see them being themselves, and we kinda do every once in a while.
Okay, relax. There was an accounting error. We said it.
Now double it for being a dickhead. You got 10 seconds.
Stupid bats, you're ruining date night!
These are good moments. We get to have a little bit of fun with these colourful characters, but because these moments are too few and far between, it ultimately feels like kind of wasted potential because we didn't get enough of them. And honestly, I think the biggest problem with Suicide Squad's cast is its size. There are just far too many characters who need to be set up in this one movie for us to remain invested in any of them. Yes, we mainly focus on Harley Quinn and Deadshot, and in any other film we could easily use them as focal points to center the entire movie around. But Suicide Squad is hampered by the fact that we have to distribute at least a bit of focus to all of the other characters aside from the main two, such as Rick Flag, Enchantress, El Diablo, Captain Boomerang, Katana, Amanda Waller, the Joker, and so on and so on and so on. And this is a difficult feat in and of itself. Other ensemble movies like X-Men do this a lot better because they have good pacing and they know just how much focus to distribute among its cast. Avengers had the advantage of having multiple movies prior to its release, setting up each individual character and reintroducing them in quick and snappy scenes which don't take away from the movie's pacing. Suicide Squad though spends so much of its runtime setting up the characters over and over and over again that we're given almost no time to actually get to know any of them. While it'd be easy to say that these characters should have just been established in previous movies like the Avengers did, I think it would have been better to just cut the cast in half. I would have removed unnecessary additions like Katana, Killer Croc, and Slipknot, and simply allow the characters that we actually care about to take center stage. By allowing their interactions to show us what kind of people they are, instead of cramming in a painfully lazy montage scene that literally spells out who these guys are, we would have been a lot more invested in what was going on in the story. And also, I would have changed why they would have been in this team in the first place, because Amanda Waller's plan here is dumb as shit.
In a world of flying men and monsters, this is the only way to protect our country.
You serious?
So now that we've gone over the abysmal editing, the awful pacing, and the painful character butchering, it's about time that we get to the most glaring and obvious problem in Suicide Squad, that it does not make any single bit of sense. Amanda Waller's reasons for getting this crew together is given the flimsiest and most nonsensical justification imaginable.
What if Superman had decided to fly down, rip off the roof of the White House, and grab the President of the United States right out of the Oval Office? Who would have stopped him?
Well, I don't know, but I'm damn certain that none of the guys you have gathered together for your little task force would get the job done, and even if they did, I doubt they'd really stand a chance. I mean, out of all of these supervillains that you rounded up, only 2 have any supernatural powers, one of which is a witch who ends up causing more trouble than she's worth, and the other clearly doesn't have the same kind of strength or power or even interest to take on someone like Superman, as evidenced by the big CGI fight at the end of the movie.
In a world of flying men and monsters, this is the only way to protect our country.
I'm pretty sure there's safer ways to protect your country than getting together a bunch of the most dangerous criminals on the planet to fight off any potential threats, especially when the only one with any proper powers outside of Diablo is the one who ends up causing all of the problems for the rest of the film. Yeah, no matter what way you look at it, this plan makes absolutely zero sense. But you know what? I'm willing to overlook that. It's kind of easy to buy the idea that an official of the American government would so greatly overestimate his or her own abilities, so that doesn't really bother me all that much. What bothers the hell out of me is the fact that the comics had a perfectly decent reason and explanation for the Suicide Squad being formed in the first place, sitting right there for the filmmakers to use. In the comics, Task Force X is assembled by Amanda Waller as a covert black operations unit, whose jobs basically come down to assassinating dictators or taking out terrorists. They aren't the Avengers with bad guys as the group, they aren't sent in to stop world-ending crises, they're sent in to do the jobs that the American government can't be seen having a hand in. That's their purpose, and it would have made a lot more sense to have that kind of thing happening in this movie rather than what we ended up with. As has been stated by everyone else, the villain of Suicide Squad is profoundly weak on a number of levels, but for me the weakest part of her is the fact that she is the same generic I'm gonna conquer the world type villain that we've seen in a dozen other movies. And that kind of villain especially does not work in a film like Suicide Squad. Neither she nor the squad themselves feel like they belong in the same movie. They don't complement each other well, and they don't do either of the others any justice as characters. When it comes to stories involving big world-ending threats like Enchantress, it's the Justice League who should be the cast of characters sent in to stop the catastrophe, not the Suicide Squad. They're better suited to the behind-the-scenes work, the gritty, more true-to-life threats, the kind of dirty work that the heroes can't possibly be seen doing. But as a result of shoehorning in this generic gotta save the world plot in a movie about a covert black operations unit comprised of some of the worst human beings alive, it just comes across as stale, generic, and out of place. And I haven't even gotten to the ending yet. The ending of Suicide Squad is by far the weakest part of its plot. And do you want to know why? Do you want to know what makes the ending such a giant slap in the face to the audience? It confirms that the entire film, the whole 2 and a bit hours that you just spent spent watching was a giant waste of time. Enchantress is dead. Yay? I mean, she was only a threat in the first place because of this damn government using her for their own purposes. Amanda Waller is still a bitch, the government is still doing its shitty things, our cast is still imprisoned except for Harley, who suddenly gets rescued by the Joker, and generally nothing in the ending suggests that a single thing has changed over the course of these 2 hours. The movie starts one way and then ends the exact same way, with none of the characters having learned anything at all, and all of them still stuck in the exact same spot. It's just an admission that the whole movie is one humongous waste of time, and I hate it. If you want my suggestion for what the plot of this movie should have been, it probably would have been more along the lines of an action thriller than a straight-up comic book film. If it was more akin to something like, say, Mission Impossible with a darkly comedic tone with actual good comedy in it, and a more villainous cast, I feel like that would have worked better. The antagonist that they'd be sent in to defeat wouldn't be a world-ending threat, but a more down-to-earth threat, a smaller-scaled villain, as it were. I would have cut the Joker from the plot entirely, because he doesn't really do much anyway, and aside from anything else, I was honestly more invested in Harley Quinn when she wasn't pining after her bae. You could maybe add a flashback to him torturing Harley and maybe throw in a vague tease for a future Batman movie, but that would have been it for the Joker in Suicide Squad. I would have cut the team down by at least half. I mean, Slipknot, Katana, and Croc all would have been cut, everything to do with Enchantress would have been scrapped. By doing that, the film could draw its focus more to one or two of the characters that we're actually invested in, like Deadshot, Harley, and Diablo, while characters like Captain Boomerang could have made for some comedic side characters. I would have had the ending actually mean something instead of ending the exact same way it started. I would have maybe ended it the same way as the Assault on Arkham animated movie, where they all break out and Deadshot has to assassinate Amanda Waller, but we get no confirmation whether or not he did. That, I feel, would have been a much better and more satisfying ending. The point is, it wouldn't have taken that much to bring the plot of this movie up to the bracket of okay. But as it stands, Suicide Squad is incoherent, stupid, moronic, and utterly without any kind of substance to it, and the few moments where it actually does manage to take advantage of its characters or its plot only serve as tragic wastes of potential, which kind of sum this movie up in a nutshell, really. When it comes to movies, as well as any form of media, there are a myriad of different reasons why they can turn out bad. Be it the directing, the acting, the script, the studio interference, any number of individual factors can contribute to a movie becoming a disaster. Suicide Squad, though, is more than just a bad movie. It wasn't just one element which ruined the final product, it is an incompetent mess on every single level of filmmaking, from the most basic to the most advanced. And it's easy to pinpoint where each of the problems lie. The script and writing is utterly abysmal, as evidenced by lines like this.
Not me, shorty. I'm beautiful.
And the plot makes absolutely no sense from beginning to end. From the moment the squad of dangerous criminals with only one or two possessing any special powers is assembled to, quote, protect the world, you're immediately left questioning the logic behind this thing. And it's easy to see why the writing was so bad, given how David Ayer was given all but 6 weeks to pen the damn thing. The editing is atrocious on both a larger scale and a smaller scale. No scene transition works, and the editing between individual shots in each scene is laughably poor. The bizarre, inconsistent color tints plastered in random scenes only serve to make the mismatched tone even more hard to keep up with, and the way that the movie is pieced together feels like it was hacked to bits and reassembled a dozen times over by completely different people, which it was. For me, Suicide Squad is the most blatant example of why the DCEU has failed. The studio interference is plastered all over the film, from the very first frame to the very last. Every element has been tailored in some way to hit a certain demographic that Warner Brothers wanted to appeal to, and as a result of that, no aspect of the film feels original, well done, or even the least bit coherent. It's just a giant hodgepodge of comic book movie tropes, with most of the elements stolen from other, better examples of this genre without having any understanding of what made them work to begin with. Like Warner Brothers took a look at all the things that worked in random Marvel films, threw them together, and expected that to be enough to hold an audience's attention span. As is the same case with Batman v v Superman, Suicide Squad may have been improved had the studio not interfered so much in its production, but honestly, I don't think that there is a single version of this movie that could have worked, at least not at the time it was released. If Warner Brothers and DC wanted to do a Suicide Squad movie, they would have needed to wait until its cinematic universe was already firmly established. We needed to get a sense that this was a universe, a well-weaved cinematic tapestry with a variety of different people and events taking place within it, not a mismatched mess with little effort taken into making it look the least bit enjoyable or even original. That's why Suicide Squad was even more of a letdown for me than Batman v Superman. It was the DCEU's last chance to actually make something of itself, to redeem the sins of its past and actually push this franchise in a new direction. But instead, all it ended up being was a sobering reminder that the whole thing was doomed to crash and burn right from the start. So, what with it still looking like there was nobody at the wheel of the DCEU, it certainly seemed like Suicide Squad was the final nail in the coffin for this franchise. Or was it? Yeah, it was. Yeah. I mean, Wonder Woman's a great film, don't get me wrong, but I don't think even it is good enough to forgive this giant stinker of a movie. I mean, that's how bad Suicide Squad is. It's irredeemable. It's irredeemably bad. That's just how bad it is. Sorry.